Hey everyone, welcome to Localism, the podcast that asks if we're putting our power in the right places. I'm your resident guy who brings milk duds to the movie theater and host of the show, Bloomsley. In today's episode, we finally stop talking about arcane state Supreme Court cases and legal technicalities and get to what I'm calling my localist pitch. This pitch is going to come in two parts. First, I'm going to tell you a story about your life in a community that has been reoriented around localist principles. The idea is that by showing you how these principles work in action, I can, 1, get partway to convincing you that it's worth trying to achieve that vision, and 2, can make it easier to explain all the ideas and reforms that are underlying a localist government. I think it's going to be a lot better from an explanatory standpoint and a more enjoyable listening experience to give you a picture of the puzzle with all of the pieces connected first before I talk at length about each of those pieces. One housekeeping item before we continue. At the end of last episode, I mentioned that I really had two different visions for how a locally reoriented America could work. Both visions would require a lot of changes to how local authority works in America, but one would require a much larger and more extreme departure from the status quo. I called this vision the absolute model. The second vision would still be a really big change, but wouldn't require quite as radical a rearrangement of the relationships between state, local, and federal government. I call this vision the reformist model. Last episode, I said that I would use this episode partially to explain the differences between the absolute and the reformist models, but I've changed my mind. I'll actually be dedicating an episode to discussing each model in depth and going into how they work. Splitting them off into their own dedicated episode leaves more room in this episode to focus solely on the localist pitch. And that pitch is going to be consistent with both models, so it can serve as an effective base for future conversation even without going into the nitty-gritty details of the absolute and reformist models. Okay, enough teeing up. Let's get started with imagining something new, a different, fairer, and more accountable system that gives us all more agency to face the pressing problems of our time. And the first part of that imaginative process involves diving into the issues with the current system. Diagnosing those issues will help us understand how a local reorientation, a devolution of power to the local level, can help cure many ills of modern America. I got a little fired up writing all this stuff, so apologies in advance. This is florid and dense and very ranty, even by the standards of this show. And we're going to get into all of it just as soon as Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech plays our awesome intro song. See y'all in a second. Here's what I want you to do. Close your eyes. I want you to look deep inside yourself and find that one issue that you're super passionate about. This is the thing that keeps you up at night, that you argue with friends and family about, that gets you into trouble at Thanksgiving, that makes you worry about or get excited for the future. Maybe it's the things your kid learns and reads in school. Maybe it's the way our healthcare works in America. Maybe it's taxes, or gun rights, or racial equity, or religious freedom. Maybe it's that your rent has gone up 5 years in a row and minimum wage has stayed the same. Maybe it's that companies won't sell you fire insurance anymore. Maybe it's vaccines, or military spending, or water rights, or high-speed rail, or gas subsidies, or NAFTA, or the price of eggs. It's probably different for everyone, but everybody has something that really gets them going. Here's what I want you to do. Dredge that issue up in your head. Think about it. Think about how it makes you feel. Think about how you wish it could be. Think about the ideal world, the ideal country, where everything works out on that issue exactly how you want it to. Got this ideal picture in your head? Great. Now open your eyes. Look around you. Take in the real world. Ask yourself, that topic that you care a lot about, that you know a lot about, the one you just envisioned an ideal outcome for. Under our current political system, what is your ability as an individual, one person, to make a difference on that topic? What is the degree of control you have over the laws surrounding that topic? Your degree of say on how we can get to that ideal outcome that you just imagined? How much say do you have in the laws of America and of your state? Laws that you are required to follow on penalty of monetary fine, imprisonment, and violence. If you woke up tomorrow and said, I am going to dedicate every moment of every day of the rest of my life to advocating for this one issue, how much of a difference could your work make? Now, I don't know who's listening to this. Maybe you're someone special. A billionaire, a political insider, a lobbyist, a member of the Saudi royal family, etc. Most of us aren't that. I sure as hell am not that. So here's my answer to the question of how much agency I have to change the political issues I care about the most. Basically, at the federal and state level, zero. Zilch. Nada. Nothing. Now that's being a little dramatic. Even if the halls of politics are closed off to the average American, there are still things that we can all do. But what's not dramatic is that our political system has been captured by dynamics and interests that are indifferent at best and hostile at worst to the political agency of individual citizens like you and me. When you take away the glitz and glamour that shine through the middle school history lessons, here is essentially how America functions. Hundreds or thousands of miles away from American citizens, the federal government makes laws that bind every American. These laws emanate from three bodies. The first is the federal Congress. Congress is full of career politicians who obtain their positions by being more successful at attracting large donations from corporate or other entities. In the overwhelming majority of cases, the politicians who attract the most money to support their campaigns are the ones who win their elections. So naturally, upon election, they serve their moneyed interests, and they have to continue to serve their moneyed interests, because otherwise they will not be able to create and sustain their congressional power. Almost always, these moneyed interests are not the same as the voters who elected them and who are hoping that their congressional representatives will take care of them. Speaking of those everyday voters, their role is limited to casting a vote every 2 or 6 years. Aside from that one act, the average American citizen has no ability to sway what happens in the halls of Congress. One act, on one day, in one period every 2 or 6 years. The House of Reps is a bit better in that it allows people to voice their preferences once every 2 years. Aside from that, Congress need not and does not care about the average person. And seats in this corporate Congress are assigned on the basis of constituent states' population size. So, if you happen to have the misfortune of being born into a state with a low population, tough luck. Your choices and preferences are simply less important than those who happen to be born in another more populous state hundreds or thousands of miles away from your community. The second body that makes laws in America, at least at the federal level, is the ever-changing and utterly dull mass of alphabet soup federal agencies that issue laws by regulation. These are in some ways even worse than the captured Congress. At least congressional officials can, in theory anyway, eventually be removed by voters if they pass laws that Americans don't agree with. Of course, in practice what happens is that those in the federal Congress cling to their seats for so long that we are now ruled by a bunch of wealthy octogenarians with entrenched power in their respective political parties. But at least the possibility remains that a miracle could happen, and the voters could choose someone else. There is no role for citizen choice when it comes to administrative agencies. The officials who run these agencies are appointed by the president with the, quote, advice and consent of the Senate, meaning that voters have an incredibly tenuous say in who gets appointed. The president just says, these are the options, and we all have to live with that. Invariably, it is only political gamesmanship and party loyalty that results in agency heads being appointed, not merit, or experience, or responsiveness to popular opinion. Once seated, the heads of administrative agencies and their hordes of career bureaucrat staff, and believe me, I know what I'm talking about, I am part of that horde of career bureaucrat staff, churn out regulations that have the full force and effect of federal law. It isn't as simple as just putting pen to paper and saying, this is the law now. There is a process called notice and comment rulemaking that theoretically allows the public some input before a final rule is published. But in practice, this process is utilized solely by corporate or political interests, and agencies will often simply use the notice and comment process as a cover before issuing their intended rule anyway. And it's also true that individual agencies can only regulate within their respective legal area and within the confines of their originating statutes. Thus, the Department of Labor can only regulate things having to do with, like, minimum wage or overtime pay. OSHA can only regulate things having to do with workplace safety. The Department of Agriculture can only regulate stuff having to do with food or other agricultural topics, etc. But despite this seeming like something of a check on agency power on paper, in practice, it does not actually diminish the ability of the federal executive to pass legislation undemocratically, which is to say it does not diminish the ability of federal agencies to act like de facto legislatures, governing bodies. That's so for two reasons. First, while any one agency might be railroaded into legislating only within a narrow area, there are so many federal agencies at this point that there is basically one to cover most significant aspects of economic and even personal life. Each of those individual agencies may be staying in their lanes, but when you put those lanes together, it's a massive highway that is ever expanding to accommodate the growing traffic of regulations. Second, and this is a bit more subjective, but I do believe it's true, most agency heads look at the laws limiting their authority as unwanted barriers rather than principled backstops. Thus, agencies will dip, duck, and use all sorts of trickery to step beyond the permitted authority and to reach into areas that even they do not seriously believe they have the right to meddle in. Sometimes this is done from genuine good intent. The captured and compromised federal Congress will sometimes provide limitations out of cruelty rather than caution. But oftentimes the limit pushing and limit ignoring is done to push the agenda of the political forces that installed the agency heads and sustain their continued comfort in their federal positions. At no point is the objective to express the will of the people. The objective is, implicitly or explicitly, to implement the agenda of a technocratic few who hand down rules from above, either out of a benevolent tyranny, we know better than everyone else because we're the experts, or a cold calculation of profit and gain. I've been put into this position by a party that wants to make money, and since I'm aligned with that party, I need to make decisions that will also make me money. The third body is the federal court system and its ultimate symptom, the Supreme Court. This is the worst and least responsive body of all. Federal judges, especially circuit judges and Supreme Court justices, answer to no one but themselves. They are appointed by an already deficient Congress to lifetime seats that they cling to even as their minds and bodies fail. As I record this podcast, there is a 97-year-old judge that is challenging the fact that she was removed from her federal judicial position on a federal circuit court. This is the kind of entitlement that is particularly endemic with federal judges. They understand their lifetime positions as just that. Lifetime is in until I am dead and buried, not until I've reached the end of my working career. Such it is with Newman, so it was with Ginsburg. This entitlement and self-importance, judges are some of the least humble and most tyrannical personalities you will ever meet, especially federal judges, stems from an idea, an ethos of themselves as above and beyond the mere peons and systems and organizations that their rulings impact. In the judge's eyes, they are an elite group of deciders, people who not only fail to question whether it is good that a group of unelected officials essentially determine the country's laws, but also fail to question and indeed have no doubt whether they themselves have obtained a legitimate mandate to wield that power. Federal judges, and in particular Supreme Court justices, present themselves as neutral arbiters who are outcome agnostic and are simply calling balls and strikes. Some say this and actually believe it themselves. Others use it as a convenient facade to shield them from criticisms while they let their biases and beliefs run amok. Neither are correct. In truth, all judges, particularly those inhabiting courts of highest review, are in fact legislators, not mere umpires who record and communicate quantitative results. They may at times play that role, but most of the time they act in their capacity as legislators. And this might seem strange because we are often told in our education, no, a legislator and a judge perform very different roles. The judge is just reading the law and saying this should be the outcome. But here's why judges are really legislators. The role of a legislator is to create a new law. And there are two ways to create a new law. The first is to birth a wholly original law. This is to say there is no law in this area at all, and we're now going to write one and pass it. But there's a second way. And that second way is to modify an existing law, to change it such that the original law no longer exists and something new has taken its place. I think we all can agree that some of the authority to look at a law that has been passed through legislative processes and then change that law so that it means something else must also be a legislator. They are creating a new law out of the building blocks of the old law. This is exactly what the Supreme Court, really any court, is doing every time it issues a ruling. The act of deciding a case is essentially never as simple as reading the law, applying it to the relevant facts, and reaching a predetermined conclusion. The law is immensely complicated and utterly obtuse. It's a bundle of jargon, structure, interpretive principle, and constitutional limit. Even Congress itself rarely fully understands the laws it passes. Wherever there is doubt or ambiguity in how a law can be interpreted, there is room for disagreement on how that law should be interpreted. An ambiguous law contains multitudes. It presents multiple possible interpretations, each of which is usually as comprehensible and reasonable as the other, and all these conflicting meanings are crammed together in a state of equality until a militant party comes to drive them all away except one. This is what a judicial decision does. It turns a law that was previously ambiguous and thus worth fighting about in court, instead of settling, into one that carries a definitive meaning, or at least one that contains less ambiguity than before. Put another way, the essential role of a high-level federal judge is to take an old law and turn it into a new law, one that has been collapsed into a novel state of certainty that is utterly unlike the law that existed pre-decision. There is simply no way to interpret a law without also destroying that law and creating it anew. Interpretation is creation and destruction, the favoring of a particular meaning and the discarding of others. And creating and destroying laws is exactly what a legislator does. The upper echelons of the federal judiciary is just the other side of the lawmaking coin, the tails to Congress's heads. Congress writes a law that it does not understand, and in interpreting what that law means, the Supreme Court reforges it into something different, something more certain. It takes both faces of the coin to actually write a law. What this means is that a group of 9 unelected lawmakers hold the fate of all America in their hands. Nobody voted for them. There is no mechanism to remove them. There is no way to avoid their judgments. Indeed, the Supreme Court resents the idea that they should at all be accountable towards or responsive to the public at large, the citizens that theoretically give them their mandate of power. America is not a democracy. It is not even an inferior republic. It is a feudal realm of personal rule sharing among 9 jackasses in robes who can create or destroy any law they please with no fear of consequence. The only reason they do not exercise their rule more broadly is because they find it taxing and troublesome to hear more than about 150 cases a year, despite receiving thousands and thousands of petitions. If the Supreme Court were ever to grow more vigorous, more ambitious, then there is nothing that the American political system as it exists could do to stop their expansion of power. So we have laws that emanate from 3 federal groups: Congress, executive agencies, and federal courts. These are the supreme law of the land. They apply to all areas in America equally. There is no room for gradient or partial change or principal difference. One set of rules for one nation. Federal governance is a winner-take-all game where changing how, let's say environment-conscious laws work in Florida requires changing how they work across the entire country. This unresponsive system of zero-sum rule from afar creates discontent, and that discontent is expressed in the vitriol and genuine hatred that arises between, for example, the politically average residents of Texas and California. These groups have irreconcilable cultures, interests, beliefs, and ideals. Because they are forced to run the same federal gauntlet to pass laws that effectively further those ideals, they are forever doomed to be at odds and must fight each other viciously to prevent the other from succeeding. But why does that need to be the dynamic? If not for the shared federal system that hung over their heads, Texas and California wouldn't really need to care about what their rival is doing within its own borders. They are not so economically entangled that they rely on each other. They're separated by pretty long distances. If both were allowed full power to manage their own affairs, to pass their own laws that furthered their own interior ideals, then the reason for their conflict, and thus the reason for their mutual hatred, would vanish. It is only the need to navigate the zero-sum game of federal politics that really puts the interests of most liberal and conservative states at odds. But so long as they must turn to the same federal bodies to pass binding laws on the most important topics, they are doomed to continued rivalry and discontent. In short, America's federal government is overly large, ineffective, slow, uncaring, and callous. It deprives people like you and me the ability to go out and perform effective actions via exercises of political agency. There is no room for your action either as a matter of unforgiving quantitative impact or as a matter of qualitative care for and responsiveness to your beliefs and ideals. It sets people against each other who by rights ordinarily wouldn't even need to give each other the time of day, spare each other a thought, and could coexist in comfortable disagreement. I don't need to tell you all this stuff, despite the fact that I just spent like 20 minutes ranting about it. You already know it. You already feel it. You feel it in every time elections are reduced to the shinier two turds cropped out by billionaire sponsors. Or the Supreme Court wakes up and decides, today this right exists and this one doesn't. Or when your business violates some regulation that you never heard of and that you literally had no say in passing. You have lived the frustrations and flaws of the systems simply by virtue of being American. They are impossible to escape. And we just see these dynamics play out again in miniature at the state level. Now, maybe things are a little bit better just because state governments are almost always vastly closer to the communities they serve than DC is to a lot of the country, and the reduced number of state versus federal citizens means that every state citizen's once a few years vote quantitatively counts more. States also allow for some increased citizen input by allowing them to elect their judicial officials, only some states, or by collecting signatures for referendum processes that can change the law via proposition. But there, these sort of low-level improvements end. Just as in the federal government, state governments are almost always captured by corporate and political interests that could care less about the communities that state governments regulate. Sometimes they are even more captured than the federal government. Because state governments are less important in the American system than the federal government, it is generally cheaper and less difficult to run for state office, which accordingly means that moneyed interests can spend less to ensure a given state politician is elected or appointed. Just like federal level laws, state level laws largely preempt local laws. This means that communities are again confronted with a situation where it is the people and entities outside of a community who have determinative say on what happens in the community. Just like the federal government, state courts are often occupied by octogenarian elites who disdainfully legislate from on high while pretending to be unbiased, and who enjoy their positions for life with no avenue for democratic accountability, unless they're elected. Just like on the federal level, state politics becomes a game, where communities with the most people in them win, even if those communities are hundreds of miles away from where you live and full of people who do not share your values or needs. The zero-sum game of state government domination means that communities that ordinarily would be comfortable in coexisting with one another are instead forced into bitter feuds. A state gas tax falls equally on the walkable urban centers and the rural towns where everyone must drive to work. And so the rural and the urban denizens must fight hammer and tongs to see whose interests will win out, rather than simply allowing each community to decide for itself what it wants. And for all the reasons we spent the past 3 episodes talking about, the relationship between state and local governments is actually more coercive than the relationship between state governments and the federal government. The states at least have the 10th Amendment to protect them from the federal government going beyond its allotted authority. But in most states, in every dual enrolled state, there is no limit to the allotted authority of a state government over a local government, because the prevailing theory and legal understanding of the relationship between state and local governments is that a local government is just a creature, an underling, a servant of its generative state government, and therefore can be bullied or crushed or declawed at the state legislature's impunity. Thus, the problems of the American system are twofold. Determinative power is placed in the hands of those who are furthest from the communities they govern rather than those who live within it, and the processes by which that determinative power is exercised rely on and express the preferences of a privileged few rather than the citizenry as a whole. Solving these problems requires creating a new American system that possesses the exact opposite characteristics. This would be a system where determinative power is placed in the hands of those who directly inhabit the communities they govern, with any power adhering to distant parties being necessarily subordinate and preemptible. This would be a system with a set of processes that makes this locally determinative authority reliant on and expressive of the citizenry as a whole rather than a privileged subset. And here is a picture of what I think that system would look like. Let's play a bit of pretend again, like we did at the beginning of this episode. Close your eyes. Imagine you're going to sleep the night before an incredibly important session at the town hall. Several controversial and difficult issues are going to be up for vote, and debate has been raging in your community for months on what the best path is to take on each topic. Tomorrow's votes include a vote to raise the minimum wage, place a 5% tariff on goods manufactured in China, increase the taxes on those in your town who are in the top 1% income bracket, and allow for concealed carry of firearms without a permit. Your local government has the authority to regulate on all of these things, so the consequences of the vote for each issue are significant. You yourself have very strong feelings on how each issue should be resolved. You're turning over your hopes and fears for tomorrow late into the night, but eventually you do manage to go to sleep. You wake up the next morning. It's a Saturday, but you have work, so you duly trudge to the site and do your best to be productive while all the while keeping your mind on tonight's town hall meeting. On lunch, you get a call from your neighbor. She's trying to figure out how to vote on one of the issues being considered at the meeting, and she wants your opinion. You spend 15 minutes debating on the phone, you disagree with your neighbor, and in the end, neither of you is able to convince the other to change their tune. Finally, you clock out, head home, grab a quick bite to eat. You are exhausted and tired, and you really don't want to drag yourself out there, but you still make yourself go and carpool with your neighbor to the town hall. The place is packed. The hall was expanded into a much larger building after the Localist reforms. But even with the extra seating, there are a lot of people in overflow rooms or standing in the halls or even outside. The only point of business tonight is the vote on the 4 proposed pieces of legislation, and after being duly called to order, voting begins immediately. Everyone is familiar with the process. As soon as order is called, people begin to form orderly lines behind the town hall's several voting booths. Whether or not the laws will pass is a simple matter. Everyone in your town gets one vote. Those votes are cast for or against each law. At the end, if there are more votes for passage than those against, then the law is passed. If there are instead more votes against passage, then the law does not go into effect. One person, one vote, one majority result on each issue. Now, while the hall is certainly crowded, it isn't the case that literally every single person in the community is there. That would be unreasonable to expect. Many people aren't in the same position as you and may work weekend nights or have physical challenges that make in-person attendance impossible, or be sick, or just not have the time or interest to engage in local politics. Plus, a new town hall would burst at the seams with people if literally everyone from your town showed up at the same time. It is perfectly acceptable for as many people who want to vote in person to show up and do so. The vote's procedural rules stipulate that if you're lined up by a certain time, then you have the right to record a vote, even if you have to wait in line for hours to do so. But in order to accommodate those who want to have their voice matter, but who don't have the time or ability or interest to be present in person, your community has what's called a proxy system. Under this proxy system, an eligible voter within the community can choose to delegate their vote to another eligible voter. The second eligible voter then votes on the first voter's behalf, with the second voter's vote being counted twice, once for his own vote and once for the person who delegated him her vote. A voter can make another voter her proxy at any time and for any reason. Similarly, and very importantly, a voter can withdraw that authority from her proxy at any time and for any reason. The point is to make sure that everybody gets to cast a vote, while also allowing voters to let their trusted friends, neighbors, and family members cast votes on their behalf when needed or desired. And if a proxy ever misuses this power, he quickly finds himself deprived of his authority once the delegator withdraws the proxy authorization. This might seem complicated, but it's actually pretty simple in practice. Your mom's been really busy this past month, and she trusts you to vote in ways that she'll agree with. So she made you her proxy about a month ago. She's already let you know that she'll be withdrawing your authorization once things settle down again, and she has the time to show up to town hall meetings to vote again. During times where you yourself haven't had the capacity to show up to vote, you've had your mom or your sister act as your proxy. But today, you're the one acting as a proxy for your mom. So when you step up to the booth and fill in your ballot, you check the box for I am a proxy and then use a pen to make your voting choices. You drop the ballot off and head home, worried and hopeful in combination about what the results will be. It takes a few days for your votes to be counted, which is totally normal. The local government tallies up the votes and assigns them as being either yes or no on each issue. For those that have marked themselves as being proxies, the local government cross-checks their names with the list of people who have authorized proxies. If the voter who marks himself as being a proxy is correct that he has authorization, then that voter's count counts as 1, his own vote, plus the number of proxy authorizations he has. You were telling the truth when you marked your form saying, I'm acting as a proxy. So when they cross-check your ballot, they see that your mom authorized you to vote on her behalf. So your vote counts as 2 for each issue, your mom's vote and your vote. 4 days later, it's about 3 o'clock on a workday when one of your buddies says that the results of the vote have been released. Your boss is normally kind of a hard ass, but even she pulls out her phone to frantically scroll to the local government's webpage. You all take this as a signal that it's okay to stop what you're doing and follow suit. You scan over the results from the 4 issues, stomach rising and dropping in turn. Some of the issues turned out the way you wanted. Some of them didn't. There were curses and exclamations from around you as your coworkers read the results too. An argument, technically civil but pretty heated, starts a foment around one of the results before your boss locks your phone and orders you all back to work. Keep your head down, survive until the end of the day, and make your way back home. That night, you're lying in bed thinking over how the votes turned out on the 4 issues. You're thrilled about the results you agree with and really, really frustrated about the ones you disagree with. But despite this intense mix of emotions, one thing that doesn't weigh on you is the feeling that these 4 issues were out of you and your neighbors' hands, that these decisions were made for you by some other external party. For better or for worse, the 4 outcomes on the 4 issues you voted on represent how your community legitimately feels the world should be. The votes don't reflect the opinions of some bought and paid for politician. They didn't emanate from a legislature hundreds or thousands of miles away. The voices of you and your neighbors weren't weighed against those from people outside your community who know nothing at all about what it's like to live where you live. You didn't have to play national politics or engage in interstate fighting or defer to some place that happens to have more people living in it. It was 1 vote per community member, and when those votes were tallied up, the results were what they were. In some ways, this actually makes the sting of the results you dislike even worse. You can't explain them away by pointing to a broken system or corrupt influences. The majority of your community genuinely disagrees with you on how those issues should be. That is a truly awful realization, given how important you view these issues as being, and how passionate you are about them. When a vote truly expresses community consensus, the immediacy is painful, and you're forced to confront things about your neighbors that shock your conscience. But no matter how horrible or elated you feel about the voting results from this past round of issues, they are at least earned results. They reflect the popular will of you and those who live in your community. After so much time where votes reflected the views of the enriched and empowered, or of party elites, or at best, of those in a few dense, distant population centers, the grounded legitimacy of even a heartbreaking result means something. There is a value in knowing that a decision you know is bad is still one that is a genuine reflection of your community's will. And because your community has the power to make these decisions via the local government, you know that you can always revisit those issues that frustrated you. You can talk to your friends, family members, neighbors, schoolmates, all the people you share your community with, and try to change their minds on how these votes should have come out. You could band together with other like-minded people in your community, your neighbors, your friends, to try and persuade everyone that a different and better path is possible. And if you succeed, then your community can put those issues up for vote again. And maybe next time you'll have gotten enough people on your side that things will turn out in a way you prefer. To do this, you won't have to go to some distant state or federal capital and try and meet with some distracted politician who will promise you nothing and smile for a photo op. You won't send a letter to a legislator who will reply with a form response and disregard your opinion unless it happens to be an election year. You won't have to try and navigate around some other distant state or community that has to try and stop you because your success would mean their failure. Localist politics means that the people you need to persuade are the ones you're closest to, that you live alongside, that you share a life and a place and a home with. That makes the encounters and the arguments and the divides all the more bitter. But it also makes that convincing process, that coming together to hash out opinions and make difficult decisions, a fairer, more immediate, more community-centered, more direct, and more expressive undertaking. Meanwhile, the relevant parts of the state government have just been informed that your local government has passed the laws that your community voted for. As it happens, your state government had laws on the books for a few of the laws that your community just passed. This is perfectly normal. The state-level government has broad authority to legislate on any number of topics, including those involved in your community's vote. But the state's authority ends once your local government has acted. All state-level laws, save the individual rights and other civil liberties laid out in the state constitution, are preemptible by local laws. So while it is acceptable for the state government to set out state-level laws via the ordinary state-level small r Republican processes, the moment that a local government passes a law that contradicts a state-level law, the local law controls. Your community always has ultimate control over what laws are in effect in your community. The state is there to serve as a stopgap, the custodians of default rules that allow local governments to not have to spend every minute of every hour legislating, but state governments can't interfere with local agency in any way. Having noted the changes in your local government's laws, the state government records that its contrary laws have been preempted within the borders of your local government and ceases any enforcement actions as appropriate. Such is the nature of your state's government, which must respect the diverse patchwork of laws, judgments, values, and decisions that have arisen in the state's various local governments. That includes your local government, and also the local governments of the communities a town or two over. There are some similarities in the laws of your local government and those of neighboring local governments, but there's also quite a few differences. This can create some tensions. For example, you and one of the neighboring towns have a very different set of laws relating to certain kinds of pollution. Your two local governments are constantly at odds over how that pollution should be handled. And since you are located physically close to one another, there's really no way to avoid that fight. If one of the governments allows some pollution at a certain level, it'll float over to the other community too. But at least if you have a disagreement, your community and the other community can work together directly, without also having to contend with the opinions of other communities thousands of miles away. And though disagreements are common, so are any number of areas of agreement and clear common interest. Your local government and several other regional local governments share partnerships, agreements, coordinated projects, and several other forms of cooperation that allow you to work with other communities that share your values and opinions on items of shared interest. These can be entered into and departed freely, with no need to try and impose cooperation on those local governments that are uninterested or thousands of miles away, and also no need to wrangle with other communities that would disagree with your coalition's approaches. For example, a few months back, your community voted to join a consortium of other communities that have agreed to all contribute to cleaning up a river that runs through your part of the state. The goal is to turn the river into a place that people and animals can enjoy in each of the participating communities. And a year or two back, your community voted to leave a regional organization that was starting to be too demanding of your community's public funds and overly disrespectful of your community's contribution. Thus, both in terms of deciding how things are managed in your community and also how your community interacts with other communities in your state, it is always you and your fellow community members who have the final authority to make the important choices. And the directly democratic local government is the vehicle by which those choices are made. And that's the vision. That's the localist pitch. I'm sure that there are a lot of questions and comments and criticisms that popped in your head as we went through this little scenario. Some of those will hopefully be addressed in future episodes when we're going to go very in-depth on each of the little details of the story, including how the story fits into the absolute and reformist models. But please feel free to reach out sooner, too. I answer all the emails I get, and they may be helpful as I write future episodes. Especially if you have something that you're like, ooh, I didn't like this, or I didn't agree with this. I'll respond to you, and I promise to always be respectful even if I don't agree with what you're saying. Next time, I'll finally get into these absolute and reformist models that I keep bringing up and not explaining. That'll involve discussing how the models function, the legal interactions at their cores, their flaws, their benefits, and some of the reforms needed to achieve them. If that sounds interesting, think about following us on Spotify. And feel free to shoot me a question or comment at localistpod@gmail.com. That's localist with the T, pod@gmail.com. A huge thank you to Kevin McLeod for letting me use the two songs in this podcast, Acid Jazz and Opportunity Walks. You can find these and a bunch of other really great songs on Kevin's website, incompetech.com. And the use of Kevin's music here is licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0.